Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say welcome to our 7th monthly national outreach call at Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. I'm Rob Baxter, and I've been a proud volunteer on Real Progressives for nearly 3 years now. I'm currently the head of our human resources team. I do a lot of the recruiting and onboarding of new volunteers. So if anyone's interested in joining, you're welcome. Send me a message on Facebook. Twitter. My handle is Temple Deficit Owl with no spaces. Email at rob.baxter@realprogressives.org or through this Zoom window chat. Virginia is going to actually put the links to my pages and email in the Zoom chat. Nathan Tankus of the Modern Money Network, who's our guest speaker tonight. First, I wanted to say, though, if you're not subscribed to Nathan's blog, you should do so as soon as possible. It's called Notes on the Crises, the Pandemic-Induced Depression from a Monetary, Political, Economy Perspective. It's at nathantankus.substack.com. And after this call, we're going to open the floor for some questions. You could chat in the Zoom window to let us know that you want to ask Nathan a question.
It was going to introduce Nathan. And for those who don't know, Nathan's the research director of the Modern Money Network. He's a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. But more importantly, he's an old friend of Real Progressive. Steve has done many interviews with him on video, on his old show, and on Macro and Cheese. We had a 3-part series with Nathan. Nathan's really good with banking, public banking, the Federal Reserve, the Green New Deal, the fiscal implications of it. Rob just mentioned the blog, but Nathan's been doing this blog that has just taken off. I think it's only about a month old, and he has something like over 2,000 subscribers, has been getting all kinds of mainstream mention. He was quoted in Bloomberg, Fortune magazine, The Week, and American Prospect and New Yorker newsletters. His work was cited by the British Prime Minister. Woohoo! And then all over Twitter, Stephanie Kelton, Joe Weisenthal of Stalwart, Alexandra Skaggs, and so many more. But we want to get started. So Nathan, I am turning it over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been quite an amazing experience. You know, the old saying from the last crisis was never let a crisis go to waste. I think I pretty effectively, from a lot of different sources, are going to be on Weisenthal's podcast Odd Lots tomorrow. That should come out tomorrow, again on the Fed crisis. So if you want to listen to something similar to what I'm going to be talking about tonight, that's another place to go. But in general, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of hunger for good information right now, and I've managed to be lucky enough to step in the void for a lot of people and get a lot of crazy attention. I can tell you that 4 of the people who are signed up for free emails are people at the FDIC, and some relatively high up people at the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Some other weird, wild names, Associate General Counsel of Facebook took out a paid subscription. So it's been quite an interesting time where a lot of journalist friends of mine who have built up relationships over the years have been very vigorously endorsing paying attention to me and paying attention to what I write, and there are a lot of people listening, and so it's been a weird kind of crazy experience. Hopefully there'll be a lot more like that coming soon, and we can leverage that to really get some different information out there. And so I felt like probably worthwhile to saying a little prologue on that experience on the Substack, which I think is going to only grow and get a lot more attention. And I'm doing a Monetary Policy 101 series there. There are already two posts up, and hopefully that'll be a weekly thing every Tuesday, and hopefully that'll be something that really develops things and gets going. So that's what I want to say on that. In terms of what's been going on in terms of the crisis, a good place to start would be actually my 101 blog post on Tuesday, which was about collateral policy. Basically, what kind of things you need to pledge to the central bank, to the Federal Reserve, in order to get a loan. So, we know in our own lives, you get a mortgage. Part of why you're able to get a mortgage is because the house secures the loan. You'll get foreclosed on if you stop paying, and their hope is that they'll be able to sell the home and make back whatever they put out in a loan. And that's kind of our consumer experience of collateral, but there's all sorts of assets that can be collateral. And not only do banks take collateral for loans, but the central bank in turn takes collateral from banks. And that policy, what you choose to have as collateral, has huge implications. One of the quotes that I quoted in the blog post is that if the only collateral that you can use to get a loan from the central bank are igloos and igloo-backed securities, then suddenly there's going to be a big incentive to build igloos. And so that's a lot of what you choose to be acceptable collateral is the kind of loans that you're incentivizing. So if mortgages are easy to pledge to the central bank to get a loan, then banks are more likely to make a lot more mortgages. And this is kind of something that becomes true across the board. And a big part of crises is to support making loans across the board. The Federal Reserve accepts a lot more of different kind of collateral, and accepts a ton more of different types of things that you can take. And that's what we've seen right now. Like, there's a lot of complicated crisis facilities that you can look on. The term asset backed loan facility. There's a new facility related to what with the Small Business Association program, the payroll protection program. There's all sorts of different programs, but they basically go into two categories. One is either expanding what the Federal Reserve will accept as collateral from loans, and then debts that the Federal Reserve is going to outright purchase. So the big thing is, of course, the Federal Reserve has launched a primary credit market, corporate credit facility, and a secondary market corporate credit facility. And basically all that means is that they're buying corporate debt both directly from non-financial corporations and buying them from market participants, from pension funds and so on and so forth. And I think that's the big distinguishing mark of this crisis, is the support that we're providing across the board to the economy, not merely expanding what the Federal Reserve accepts in collateral to itself, but also expanding its purchases and basically saying that corporate America's borrowing costs aren't going to be allowed to explode relative to the Federal Reserve's interest rate target. And that's a whole new thing. It's basically, they're not saying it out loud because it's uncomfortable to say, but it's basically establishing that corporate America is necessary infrastructure in the United States, that it controls, means of production that we can't let be liquidated in bankruptcy, and let these firms just fail across the board and fire most of their workforce. But the problem with recognizing that is the necessary corollary is that these aren't simply private entities, that they're part of the infrastructure of our society, and thus they're areas where there is there needs to be public say in what goes on in them. If not, nationalizing them, simply that workers are stakeholders in corporate America, that consumers are stakeholders in corporate America, that other members of society besides shareholders and management are stakeholders in what happens in corporations. And I think that, that's the distinguishing mark of this crisis is we're doing our normal crisis thing, which is expanding what we accept in collateral, providing support to financial markets across the board. But the big things we're doing is we're basically backstopping the ability to borrow across the board for corporate America, and then of course the other piece is that the Federal Reserve is finally stepping into the void of supporting state and local governments with the municipal liquidity facility. And that's, of course, the other piece is not just it's quote unquote picking winners and losers with corporate America, but now it's picking winners and losers in terms of state and local governments, and especially stepping into the void of the vastly insufficient state budgetary support that Congress is providing state and local governments. And the initial terms of the facility they announced is wildly insufficient, and they'll be I suspect expanding it even more, but that's a huge place to put political pressure on. And very fortunately, it's a place that I think people have been getting attention of, and even a New Jersey congressman cited my Substack in a letter on it, and then within the same day later, was a Brookings piece on it that also got cited in a more wide-ranging letter that got from Elizabeth Warren and Schumer and Pelosi and all these people. But I think that's what I would kind of say is the big three things is go read the collateral policy blog post, but that what the Federal Reserve accepts in collateral to loans is important, and in crises it really loosens up and provides preferential access to credit and accepts a lot more things in collateral. It goes on purchases, and what's really notable is in this crisis is that they're purchasing non-financial corporate debt and municipal debt, and that's a whole different scope of the Fed. And as it seems like the federal government is going to fail to do what it needs to do fiscal policy wise, I think we're going to see even more pressure for the Federal Reserve to be backstopping state and local governments in conducting their own fiscal policy. And I think there's going to be a whole politics around the Federal Reserve picking winners and losers that there wasn't before. And I think there's also going to be questions about why the Federal Reserve couldn't or didn't do this a decade ago. Why didn't the Federal Reserve, backstop Detroit in 2009? Why didn't Federal Reserve do anything about Puerto Rico? I think both there's going to be a lot of pressure for the Federal Reserve to use its power now, and there's also going to be a lot of pressure. There's going to be a lot of retrospective reviewing what the Federal Reserve has done and reviewing its forbearance, its unwillingness to support state and local governments when it was, when I think a lot of people would have seen it as absolutely critical. Yes, this pandemic has been huge and it's affected everyone, but Hurricane Maria was no less of a crisis for that region, and could have easily been justified using emergency authority to support Puerto Rico, and it didn't. And so who you support and don't support I think is going to be a big thing. So I mean, I don't have a super ton to go over, and obviously I could talk details about a lot of different programs, but I think that's kind of the main thing that I would say. And then of course, the other piece, which I think some of the chat comments are bringing up, is the fiscal policy's been hugely inadequate. The programs they've done have just been completely arbitrary and nonsensical. $350 billion for paycheck protection that was supposed to be for small businesses, but have mostly benefited franchises of small businesses or even just big businesses where the criteria for what a small business was simply less than 500 employees per establishment, has been totally nonsensical. And it's routed in deficit politics. It's routed in, a kind of, oh no, we can't do an unfunded mandate. yeah. And we can't do an unfunded mandate, so we're not going to just provide payroll checks support across the board. We're going to do it in these small dollops, which makes everything about who's getting the limited amount of paycheck protection. And of course, it's the more established players, the ones that already have credit lines with banks, and the fact that banks are the ones administering these programs altogether, when it shouldn't be a forgivable loan, it should be grants with penalties and run by tax authorities. I mean, it's just across the board, this has been a disaster of epic proportions in terms of them managing the policy response. At a fundamental level, you need to be able to deal with the loss of income, and no one's facing up to the need to support incomes. And so we're just leaning more and more and more on larger and larger Federal Reserve interventions, when the Federal Reserve is either unable or unwilling to cross that line into directly increasing people's incomes. So I think that's, there's a lot there. I kind of talked a little bit quickly. So I think, probably given everything that's happened, it took some time to get on the call. It might be better to just have a longer Q&A and have people ask more questions, and talk it out more.
Okay, I have a really basic one, which is, why are the overnight interest rates so important? And are they important to us or only to the banks? I'm always trying to figure out what affects our economy and what affects the corporate world.
Yeah, that's a good question. Overnight interest rates are important because basically they're the start of the spread across interest rates. Generally, very short-term interest rates and the expectations of where they're going to be affect interest rates across the board. Now, again, that is definitely true that there is a limited effect that they have, because if the level at which interest rates fall for short-term interest rates borrowing between financial institutions may not be fully reflected in the borrowing costs of you or I, but it does have an effect. So, for example, and I would say it's having a greater and greater effect all the time. It used to be that there was this complicated, rigged system of bank borrowing that happened in the UK. It was called LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. But because it was rigged and a system that was dollar interest rates but not under the US's control, and for various other reasons, a big part of the project, and I would say one of the most successful projects of financial reform in the past decade, has been phasing that out. And now what they phased in is called SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, which is basically just the rate at which you can borrow overnight secured by a treasury security. And so now you have corporate securities, but also credit cards, mortgages that are more directly related to SOFR, to the secured overnight financing rate. These interest rates are starting to have even more of a direct effect on consumers' experience of interest rates. Now, of course, banks can change this. Banks can change their spreads arbitrarily. If the bank offers you, we're going to give you a loan that's SOFR plus 4%. If it's credit card term or whatever, they might change that to SOFR plus 5%. Or the prime rate on your credit card might not be. They might have some ability to, mess with it and change the rules around it. But in general, there generally is an effect in terms of when short-term interest rates fall, that there is an effect on private borrowing rates, especially when they're expected to be persistent. Like, I think you would expect that mortgage rates are going to stay from here on are going to stay pretty low. I think like the rate on my credit card, for example, dropped with when interest rates dropped. So I think it has an effect. I think it's not as important to us. What's important to us is income. We care about income and, to a lesser extent, disposable income, and the lowering our interest payments a little bit, helps a little bit, but it doesn't really help us make it through our monthly expenses, and pay our monthly bills anywhere near as much as just a raise would. And so the problem with this kind of policy is just it's very indirect. It has limited efficacy in terms of being able to help us, but it can have a positive effect on our experience. Yeah, but that point is critical. If you can't pay your mortgage, if you can't afford a bill, if you don't have an income, especially right now, the fact that the interest rate dropped on your mortgage a couple points is irrelevant. The best you can get is interest rates drops. You can take advantage of refinancing it, and you might be able to defer a mortgage payment for a few months. But it's the deferral that's the real benefit to you, not the interest rate. So I think that's absolutely right. I think interest rates right now just miss the point. But it's basically all the Federal Reserve has is interest rates, is expanding its collateral schedule. It's fiscal policy is the tool that directly helps people the most, and that's and is the ability to be able to deliver immediate, easy relief. And we just don't use fiscal policy, but it's not really to a limited extent. I have some sympathy for the position that central bankers are in, because that's not the role that they've been given of fiscal authority. And to me, the biggest sins that central bankers commit is when they talk about fiscal policy and when they seem to explicitly or implicitly endorse austerity or worry about the deficit, because that's when they're encroaching upon the space that really matters, the fiscal policy part. And that's where that I think that the most detrimental is to the extent to which they ideologically defend their place as the center of where economic policy should be happening.
Right. Now Sam has a question.
Yeah, I have a perspective, a strategy perspective for something that I would think would be useful. Firms should be subjected to market discipline, right? Instead of padding their balance sheets, we can say, look, we're going to nationalize your payroll, so you won't have any excuse for laying off workers. And yes, your stock prices are going to fall, but you know what? That's capitalism. Times are good. You're constantly reminding the public that it's capitalism. Why don't we subject them to their own medicine in bad times as we do in good?
Okay, but what I guess what I'm having trouble getting is what does market discipline in that circumstance mean if we're nationalizing payroll? Does it just mean that we're just saying none of the other costs matter, and go into bankruptcy or whatever?
Why would they need to go into bankruptcy, right? You don't have to worry about payroll. We're taking that off their books.
They still have other costs. They still have a lot of other costs. I think we would need to do a real kind of forensic accounting that if without payroll that most businesses would be able to handle things. And then there's also I definitely agree that payroll should be mandatory, but what is the market if you think that their non-labor costs are not really significant, are not gonna
they're not significant right now when there's no demand and there's no operating.
Yeah, but
operating costs are diminished. So what are they spending?
They're diminished, but they still have operating costs. They still have rent. They still have buildings. They still have they still have probably supply contracts that they're having down the line. I think I would really need to see a lot of evidence to be convinced that that the non-payroll costs would go down to nothing. And that would also, it'd be very important in that circumstance for payroll to be for national payroll to be mandatory, because otherwise they would be doing all sorts of things to avoid programs.
Agreed,
I put a proposal out there, to suspend dividends and buybacks across the board.
That was going to be
not required any
the next part.
Any participation. To me, it's not about the shareholders. To me, it's about keeping these structures together. So, I mean, to me, I'm just, I don't, I guess one of the issues for me with the question is I don't think that the like take some of your own medicine thing gets us anywhere politically, because it just feels like a Democrat thing of, we'll own them by their own logic, but owning them by their own logic when you're dealing with right wingers just reinforces narratives of scarcity and privation and shared sacrifice that are counterproductive when what you need is kind of an expansive, inclusive public. To me, what's to me, launching like a mandatory program of payroll protection, of spending buybacks and dividends, or like basically, we're making all the conditionality mandatory across the board, and then you can either choose to accept free money or not. And then after the fact, and then as part of that, we're reforming antitrust law, corporate law, and labor law we're making worker co-determination in corporations mandatory, reestablishing the playing field of what the rules are now that we've established that, this is necessary infrastructure, and also that they're inherently rely on the public, that they are sites of governance where we have a collective interest that is not reducible to the government, but also isn't reducible to shareholders and management. To me, that is my direction to go. That's where my, the beginning of my policy proposals, that piece on suspending buybacks and dividends and limiting executive compensation, that's where I'm going.
Yeah, let me ask you this then, just to get some clarity and around it, and to be really direct. So you don't believe that private firms should be subjected to market discipline during bad times? Let me start with that.
I mean, if it's I think there's differences in different time periods. I think in a recession happens, tax revenues fall, and other sorts of spending goes up, then that is a sufficient safety net for corporations. They're not getting market discipline. What they're getting is the deficit is going to rise, and that deficit rising is going to increase their profits, and increase aggregate profits, and that's going to offset the fall in investment, which is hitting profits. That basic part of Kalecki profits equation. And I think in that's sufficient in terms of saving corporate America as a whole, and a specific company that's doing especially badly that we might not care particularly about, let's say, Uber, we might not rescue. But when it comes into a crisis like this, when we're talking about we're talking about most of corporate America being threatened, then in terms of like, put it this way, I'm ambivalent about market discipline, but I'm fine with it happening to specific firms, but I'm against market discipline as a macroeconomic phenomena, because then it's liquidationism, then it's Andrew Mellon, and then it's, if we liquidate enough, we'll get to a more efficient society on the other end of that, and I just don't believe that.
Okay, well, two things there real quick. One is that sounds like picking winners and losers again. Two, do you agree with the premise that corporate handouts, subsidies, and giveaways are inherently deflationary, in the sense that, or because of the fact, in my view, that corporations are going to use those subsidies, especially in bad times such as the crises that we're in now, to favor savings, therefore dollar hoarding over investment, as well as to engage, as you mentioned earlier, in stock buybacks?
I think it depends. I don't think that the Trump tax cuts were deflationary. I don't think they were very stimulative, but it depends where the money is. It depends how that budgetary thing is happening. Like if you give subsidies and raise taxes, and you have no conditionality, or whether it's the kind of law reform that I'm talking about, or conditionality in it, then yeah, I think that could probably be deflationary. But if it's just Trump's tax cut style spending or subsidies across the board, I think probably would be some net stimulative effect, but not a very large one.
Nathan, we have some other questions. There, Raquel. Great.
Hi,
Okay, go ahead.
Nathan. Hi, everybody. I'm kind of, I'm not an economy is not my strength, but I've worked with real progressives many times. I'm an activist and I'm currently working on coronastrike.us, which is we're backing Cooperation Jackson and Black Socialists of America in their call for labor strikes. But as a lay person, can you tell me in best case scenario, worst case scenario, what are we looking at? Where do we put the most pressure? Are we looking at something bigger than the Great Depression? Are we looking at food supply shortage? Like, what are we looking at?
I'm pretty pessimistic in terms of when it comes to unemployment and income. I wrote, over a month ago that I thought this was the fastest, largest economic crisis that's ever happened, much bigger than the Great Depression. The Great Depression was drawn out on a global level. It took time from 1929 to 1932 where it really got to the worst points, and then there was like this, at least in the United States, a rapid recovery during the New Deal, and this is much larger. Much not just global but immediately global in a way that you see a global contraction of trade and production everywhere all at once, and nothing out of Congress or anywhere else really I think is anywhere near remotely adequate to the crisis, and as a result I think a month ago I thought 25-30% unemployment was the most likely scenario. Now that feels optimistic, especially with the way they've structured aid, where the BEST program is expanded and larger unemployment insurance, which hopefully will get extended beyond July 31st, but who knows? So on that front, I'm very pessimistic. In terms of food supply, I think we're gonna have some like issues. There's gonna be some bottlenecks, but I don't think a lot of people are, this is one of the things that I'm the most worried about. I'm not particularly worried about it, because we don't really at this point have shortages of food. Now let's see what happens with our production line, and as more places get sick and there's more outbreaks in factories. It's certainly something to watch, but at this point I think we have plenty of food. The problem is getting food from the restaurant supply chain to the grocery store supply chain. That's the big problem, or just frankly just getting it into food banks, and that has been a slow process, slower than it should have been, although there are people working hard at it. Actually, I think there's an MMT fan economist who at the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who I think is actually working on this, and I think on the food supply thing, I think we're going to be okay. Especially, think it's important to remember in the United States, so much of food is so labor intensive because they're not just producing food, but they're producing food in exactly how we like it. They're producing, we get exactly the type of vegetables that we want, assuming you're not in a food desert. You get the meat exactly the way that you want it. You get the chicken cut up exactly the way you want it. And that's a very labor intensive process. Mm-hmm. So I think that the biggest threat to the food supply is labor shortages. And I think if there are labor shortages, what's going to happen is we're not just going to not have food. We're going to switch to less labor-intensive processes. Mm-hmm. You're going to get whole chickens, and you're going to have to cut up a whole chicken yourself. You're not going to have, the nice packaged, 3 breasts of chicken. There's going to be less variety and less choice. And, to some Americans, that's going to seem like the biggest crisis they've ever faced in their lives. But in terms of having to worry about not having food, you're not going to have to worry about the grocery store not having food. I don't think there'll be, things will run out more often and so forth, but basically there'll be access to food. The problem is having access to food and having the money to purchase the food. I think that's going to be the much bigger problem, with 25-30% unemployment and pay cuts and so on and so forth. That's that. So I'm very pessimistic on unemployment and incomes. I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of other people seem to be about our food supply.
Do you, I saw an economist on Jimmy Dore, I don't remember his name, but what he said was that when it reopens, it's not really about the economy reopening, it's that it also, people won't want to sit in restaurants anymore. People won't want to sit in movie theaters anymore. Some businesses won't open because we won't want to be in proximity. Like our ideas of what we feel comfortable in are going to change. Can you speak just briefly to that, and then I'll let you go?
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I don't want to speculate on it too much, but I think movie theaters are never going to get back to I think people are always going to be panicked about being, after this, I think people are always going to be panicked about being in a room wall to wall with a whole bunch of other people. I think Dr. Fauci is talking about, I think handshaking is going to, I think handshaking, even after this, even after we have a vaccine, I think is going to be something that people are more skeptical of. As he says, it's not shaking hands is a great way not to spread influenza just generally. I definitely think there's probably going to be a lot of cultural changes, but I don't think that's necessarily in the economic realm, except of course, certain businesses are going to take a huge hit. We're going to, to the extent there'll be movies and TV movies, it'll be shifting even more to the streaming world. I think my biggest concern in terms of that sort of social changes is the extent to which we become even more reliant on these digital companies, these dominant digital companies. And also they start becoming people we trust in terms of doing contact tracing, that this is a great leap forward for corporate surveillance partnered up with state surveillance. I think that's probably a big concern of mine.
Thank you.
So we have Jeff.
Do you think we should have nationalized our healthcare system and payroll? And what's your thoughts on initializing a federal job guarantee right now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was earliest on hitting was that, and something I was actually tweeting about last summer, which is more prescient now, just, that our fiscal policy would be greatly improved with Medicare for All, because, you wouldn't be relying on these state budgets in a recession when, they're trying to cut, and you would get the adequate spending that you would need when you need it, and it would be part of stabilizing the economy. And who knows, I wasn't thinking about pandemics at that time, but in a pandemic, it's even more true, because there's such a huge pressure for much more healthcare spending right at the time that state and local budgets are collapsing the most. So, I think that what our experience now definitely illustrates, first, that people really underrated the counter-cyclical benefits of Medicare for All, but second, that it's an absolute necessity to respond to coronavirus, and not just like a single payer system, but specifically the kind of extremely generous system and without fees for service that Bernie was talking about is extremely necessary in order to get people the healthcare that they need when they need it, and have that spending ramp up when you need it to ramp up. Nationalizing payroll, yeah, I mean, I was talking weeks ago about how it was insane that they capped the payroll program that was just for small businesses. I think universal payroll makes a ton of sense. Now is a good time to start the job guarantee. Sans having a competent administration to do it, I'd be worried about an administration I didn't really trust going forward with it and bungling it and then killing the idea of a job guarantee for a generation. But definitely, you need more essential workers. And this is a nice illustration that mandatory hazard pay should be a part of any job guarantee, that, it's especially something that would be triggered automatically in emergencies, in states of emergency. Part of the job guarantee pool doesn't necessarily mean being required to leave your house. And I think that's generally going to be an important thing in terms of making the job guarantee disability inclusive for immunocompromised people and such. Having access to be able to do some, at least certain amount of access to be able to do homework. So I mean, I guess my answer would just be yes across the board there.
Good points. Thank you.
Andy.
Hey, Nathan, how you doing, buddy?
Hey.
Okay, so my question has to do with the unprecedented price of a barrel of oil yesterday. Minus what it was, minus $37.
Yeah.
The bad news is that 25% of Americans thought they could go to the gas station and paid to get gas. But the potential good news, and I wanted to run this by and to let me know what you think about this, is we have certain state economies that are very reliant on oil and natural gas, like per se Texas and Oklahoma, places like that. Could this now be a really good time, even just in a business sense, for places that are going to be so badly hit by the fact that people aren't driving or doing anything like that, to implement renewable energies in places like this, because it's a viable way for them to re-energize their economies and perhaps make an income where it doesn't exist anymore. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the problem again at the state and local level is always like, how do you pull that off? How do you finance it? Part of the conversation is talking about launching local currencies, but that's going to be a big ask, especially with everything going on. I mean, I think it's necessary, but I'm not sure it's something that people are going to be confident launching big spending programs on, especially places like Texas, which I think are really reliant on sales tax. Those kind of programs are more viable when you have an income tax to back to drive them in terms of the tax drives money sense. I think the other thing is just that, it's really hard to, as much as, your economy's hit, but it's really hard to justify renewable energy when the price of oil is so low. And yes, there's these specific places where the price is actually negative, but basically it's low. You have a temporary situation in certain markets where essentially there's a shortage of storage space and there's a premium paid on the storage price, and that comes out in terms of a negative price of oil. But just with the price of oil so low, like it's very hard. I mean, this is the big problem with the liberal approach to environmentalism, where we're trying to shift the relative price between fossil fuels and other renewables. Is it relies on there not being a collapse in demand, which suddenly drives down the price of oil, and you're relying on very, very tenuous incentives, and also in a place where there's already been a ton of fixed investment burned into having oil infrastructure, which is this sunk cost that you have to let go of and just take the hit on. So I mean, I think in terms of this, I think we're still going to have to rely on a national program, even if it's doesn't seem very likely to be coming anytime soon. But who knows? With politics are going to change a lot in the next year or so. So I think let's not get too vested in our predictions for the future. But to me, it just it seems like we're still gonna be betting on a national Green New Deal there, and have to try to not rely so much on these sort of price things, and just we're just banning this amount of fossil fuel lending. We're banning this amount of fossil fuel production. We're disemploying these resources and redeploying them elsewhere. We need that sort of Green New Deal program that is mission oriented rather than sort of price mechanism oriented.
Nathan, I'd like you to meet Joe Jackson, our friend from Australia.
Hi.
My name's Joe from Oz. I'm relatively probably about 2 years into the knowledge of MMT, so I'm not way up there, but I've got the gist of it. But the question I've got for you, this is just my take on it. The stock market from time to time gets a spike, this is even now, then it takes a hit. Why should the economy be concerned with this? Am I right to assume we, the people, we create the economy, the corporations and the investors? For want of a better word, I would say they are the parasites of the capitalist system. Would I be right there, or am I?
Yeah, I mean, I'm never particularly concerned about the stock market. You know, when this was first all starting to happen and people were realizing it, people were obsessed with talking about the stock market. But to me, what was really important was what was going on with Treasury interest rates, because that's what tells you whether investors are expecting a big recession and how long they expect it to go on. And so, in terms of ordinary people, if you want to get a sense of, how investors think the economy is going, Treasury interest rates are basically where you go. And I think I totally agree that the stock market should just be ignored. I think it does matter in terms of inequality. The one thing I would say is you have to be careful to make sure that the way that you crush stocks or bring down stock valuations isn't based on collapsing the economy. It's things that target the corporations and shareholders specifically. So what I was talking about earlier in terms of suspending buybacks and dividends, that would crash the stock market or reduce it a lot, especially if it was expected that was going to last a long, long time, a couple of years at least or whatever. But I don't care about that particularly. I mean, the one exception there is, of course, there's institutional investors. The big thing in the last 40, 50 years has been to tie at least a certain substrata of ordinary people to the stock market by making their pensions reliant on it, giving them 401ks. And so there is, even though that the rich have, of course, vastly more of ownership of the stock market than everyone else, other people do have a big chunk of that. But there's alternative ways to provide support there, increasing Social Security and so on, that I think should be our alternative to just keeping up the stock market for the stock market's sake. But yeah, no, I'm a big believer in getting down dividends as much as we can. There's such a huge unnecessary increaser of inequality, and if you cap dividends, that would hit the stock market prices pretty badly.
Thank you, Nathan.
I have a question. We had Steve Keen on Macro and Chief last week, and he was talking about disagreeing with the concept that imports are of value. Imports create real value and exports are a cost. It's that whole thing about.
Yeah, I can just take it from there.
Thank you.
I think this is just he's always been kind of very myopic on this point and sort of missing the point. The point is that imports are biophysical. They're physical resources that we are getting. Exports are physical resources we're giving up. Now, yes, you can get foreign exchange. You can, if you're Argentina, you can get dollars, and that can be valuable to you. But it is important that there's a physical cost of resources you're giving up to get that, to get that quote unquote hard currency. So there's no contradiction in terms of MMT, although I would lean into the language of biophysical more, that what we're talking about is biophysical costs versus biophysical benefits, and that you might be willing to pay certain biophysical costs in order to get a certain amount of cash, which you then will use later. But it's still a physical cost, and that can be quite important, especially when you're looking at third world countries that don't control their supply chains. They can, or in countries in the global south, that you can be in a circumstance where you're using up hectares and hectares of land to get not very much dollars per hectare, and taking a lot of economic damage for not that many dollars. And that biophysical cost you might normatively or qualitatively judge is too high. Fidel Kaboub's podcast on Odd Lots is very good on this point, that like, you know, that's another trap in terms of resource use. And yes, it is important that you can get, you know, hard currency. You can get a currency that's higher up in the hierarchy by getting exports, which no one has ever denied. But it is also important that you're giving up physical resources. And I would say Stephanie's book has a lot on that. So so I would look to Stephanie's book. I think Stephanie's trade chapter is particularly good.
But if for a country like the United States, if we've lost our productive capacity, and then it's great to be able to buy cheap goods from around the world, but in a situation like the current crisis, this is what Steve Keen was pointing out. You know, we don't make our own ventilators or, you know, masks or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, but it also matters that you can get PPE. You know, yes, you may not, from a national security point of view or some other sort of independence point of view, not like getting PPE from China, but it's also important that, you know, you can get PPE from China. You can just, like, you know, have it, and that we basically are getting it gratis from them in terms of the physical resources compared to the physical resources we're giving up. You know, I think it's important that, you know, to have domestic productive capacity. And the MMT argument has never been, oh, you should just give up on having productive capacity. You know, that's a straw man of Steve's.
Right.
But you know, but that doesn't change the resource point, and the resource point is very important when you look at it from the global South's point of view, in terms of giving up a lot of resources, and giving, you know, using up hectares and hectares of land and enduring a lot of pollution in order to get you know, in order to get dollars to get, you know, your basic access to energy and food and servicing debts. You know, you know, it is important to compare the physical resources you're giving up to the ones you're getting for those countries. And yes, the U.S. does have some security concerns in terms of not being able to produce what we want when we want it. But, like, you know, in the grand scheme of things, the resource benefits, the resources we've extracted, the physical resources we've extracted from the rest of the world in comparison to what we've given up is incredible. And I think, you know, the MMT's point on that is not obliviated. It's not you know, eliminated by the economic security point, which is something that MMTers have always made as well.
Okay, well, I'm not going to keep everybody. Come check us out on our Facebook pages. Follow us on Twitter. You can search us up under Real Progressives or Real Progress in Action. If you want to volunteer, please send us a message if you're not already. It looks like a lot of the people that are on this call are already helping us out, so we appreciate that too. Everybody have a great night and take care of yourselves.